Okay, tonight, we're walking into the forest where silence holds its breath. Imagine the glow of a campfire flickering against the darkness, young voices carried on the wind, and then nothing but fear. A cold case, an unsolved mystery, a dark past buried beneath the trees of Gitchie Manitou. Welcome to Criminal Mindcast, the podcast where we tell true crime stories not just with facts but with silence, with the haunting weight of what was never said. Here, the shadows speak louder than headlines, and every pause is a reminder of what humanity tries to forget. Tonight's episode revisits the Campfire Massacre, where teenage girls saw their last light in the flames. It is a tale of innocence interrupted, fear ignited, and a community scarred by violence that time could never fully erase. The massacre at Gitchie Manitou did not emerge from a void. To understand it, we must first return to the quiet world where the victims lived, a rural American landscape that seemed safe, predictable, and filled with the gentle rhythms of small-town life. But beneath those rhythms, fractures were already forming. The girls who gathered around that campfire were teenagers, standing at the threshold between childhood and adulthood. They carried with them dreams as fragile as paper, school dances, whispered secrets, the hope of futures beyond the borders of their small community. They were ordinary, and perhaps that ordinariness makes the tragedy unbearable. Every victim had a story. Each one lived in a home marked by family rituals, by weekend routines, by ambitions their parents hoped would blossom. They were not extraordinary in the eyes of the world, but in their families they were everything. Their presence at the campfire was supposed to be a celebration of innocence. The killers, or suspected killers, came not from a distant city, but from the same world. They were young men with lives seemingly bound to the soil of the Midwest. They carried their own psychological profile, warped by secrecy, shaped by a climate where masculinity was often measured through dominance, control, and violence. Family secrets ran deep. Behind closed doors, there were histories of neglect, alcoholism, and unresolved trauma. These factors created unstable psyches, fertile ground for aggression. When control of life seems impossible, some seek to reclaim it through darker means. That imbalance can tip ordinary men into perpetrators of extraordinary violence. In this small-town murder, the line between safety and danger blurred without warning. Communities like Gitchie Manitou are shaped by familiarity, where everyone knows each other's names, where isolation feels distant. Yet it was within this intimacy that violence struck with terrifying precision. The illusion of security became its own trap. The killers carried themselves with a strange confidence, as if the crimes were inevitable. Their behaviors before the massacre hinted at disconnection. Erratic tempers, brooding silences, sudden bursts of cruelty toward animals or peers. Small signs, often ignored, became warnings written in psychological code. Those warnings went unseen until it was too late. The girls themselves embodied vulnerability, not through weakness, but through trust. They believed in their community, in the harmlessness of gathering outdoors at night. This trust was shattered by the encounter with men who viewed trust not as a bond, but as an opening to exploit. That psychological betrayal deepened the crime's horror. Understanding these characters requires acknowledging the weight of their environments. The Midwest, often romanticized as wholesome, hides scars of poverty, limited opportunities, and cultural expectations that suffocate. For those unable to escape, frustration festers. Violence, in this sense, becomes not an isolated act, but an eruption from layers of pressure. The victims walked into the woods with laughter. The killers walked into the same woods with silence and shadows. This stark contrast between intention and outcome defines the story. A meeting of innocence and corruption, of open hearts colliding with closed minds. It was not just a clash of people, but of worlds. As we peel back the layers, we see not only individuals, but archetypes. The teenage dreamers become symbols of lost futures, while the killers embody twisted forms of control. Psychology teaches us that when the need for control overrides empathy, human beings lose their humanity. What remains is cold calculation, stripped of compassion. The killer's psychological profile reveals traits of antisocial tendencies, disregard for norms, shallow emotions, and impulsivity masked as confidence. Coupled with family secrets, patterns of violence and silence, they carried within them unresolved rage. This rage was projected outward, transforming the campfire gathering into a stage for destruction. Each girl represented possibility: college, careers, love, independence. None of these futures would be realized. Their stolen potential lingers like an unfinished sentence, haunting the community. This is why such cases grip us. They remind us that mortality can be sudden, random, and undeserved, that the ordinary can collapse without warning. In communities like Gitchie Manitou, memory does not fade easily. Every family becomes a keeper of the story, every neighbor a witness to grief. The psychological toll echoes beyond the victims' homes, reshaping how trust operates within the entire town. Silence replaces laughter, suspicion replaces security. This is the true aftermath. The killers were not monsters in the way folklore imagines. They were human, deeply flawed, and frighteningly ordinary. That is what unsettles us most. Monsters can be banished, but ordinary men remind us that violence may hide in plain sight, beneath faces that smile, in voices that sound familiar. Family secrets hardened their world. Unspoken abuse, generational trauma, and the rigid expectations of masculinity all converged. In such an environment, cruelty becomes normalized, and acts of violence are rehearsed long before they are carried out. The massacre was not spontaneous. It was a performance rehearsed in silence across years of dysfunction. The psychological landscape of the victims was equally important. They were teenagers learning independence, caught between loyalty to family and the desire to create their own identities. Their decision to gather that night reflected a longing for freedom, a natural step toward adulthood. Tragically, that step collided with men shaped by chaos. The stage was set with fragile elements: innocence, trust, secrecy, and rage, woven together in ways no one present could see. In the stillness of the Midwest, these forces converged in the glow of a simple campfire, turning a gathering into something unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. The story of the background and characters is not only about who the victims and killers were, but also about how two vastly different psychological worlds collided with devastating consequences. What began as ordinary teenage dreams collided with hidden fractures and unresolved darkness. In the next part, we move into the timeline, from the girls' final hours of laughter to the terrifying shift that extinguished their voices and altered everything forever. The night began with laughter. It was an ordinary gathering, one of those evenings where friends come together to share warmth, stories, and the fragile sense of belonging that only adolescence can produce. The campfire glowed, its flames flickering against the dark canopy of the Gitchie Manitou woods. The murder timeline, however, was already in motion. The killers knew of the gathering, whether by chance encounter or whispered rumor. Their approach was deliberate, their movements careful, as if rehearsed. For the girls, the fire was a symbol of safety. For the killers, it was a beacon drawing them closer. Witnesses later described the girls' last seen alive moments as filled with joy. Their voices echoed across the forest, rising and falling with the crackle of wood. They roasted marshmallows, shared confidences, and reveled in the freedom of being away from adult supervision. It was a fleeting taste of independence. The first sign of danger was subtle. Strange behavior from figures lurking in the shadows, footsteps where no one should have been. Some of the girls sensed it, a shift in the night air, a silence broken too abruptly, but they brushed it off. Fear seemed too distant, too unreal to intrude. The killers stepped forward, disrupting the night. They carried weapons, but more than that, they carried intent. Their behavior was erratic yet calculated, moving between intimidation and silence. For the girls, confusion reigned. Was this a prank, a threat, or something unthinkably darker? That uncertainty was the first fracture in safety. Time slowed as chaos erupted. The campfire, once a source of light, became a stage for terror. Shouts replaced laughter, footsteps turned frantic. The murder timeline fractured into seconds, each moment carving deeper scars into memory. The girls were forced to confront fear in its purest, most suffocating form. One victim tried to reason with the attackers, appealing to shared humanity. Another attempted escape, running into the trees where shadows swallowed her whole. Their actions reflected instinct, survival, resistance, desperation. Yet the killer's strange behavior, sometimes calm, sometimes violent, left the victims disoriented, unable to predict what would come next. The killer's control grew absolute. They manipulated the scene with threats and force, ensuring no one could flee unnoticed. In psychological terms, this was dominance enacted physically. By turning the campfire gathering into a trap, they stripped the girls of agency, rendering them powerless in the space once filled with joy. Moments blurred, each scream, each cry, each silence layered into the night. Witnesses later struggled to recall exact sequences because trauma distorts memory. Still, fragments emerged, pleading voices, sudden gunshots, the heavy silence that followed. These were not random sounds, they were the rhythms of life collapsing into death. The last seen, alive moment for several victims was marked by resistance. They clung to each other, as though physical closeness could defy mortality. In those gestures, we glimpse courage. Teenagers facing the unimaginable, refusing to surrender their humanity, even as violence encircled them. Such courage lingers longer than the crime itself. The killers exhibited strange behavior, even after asserting control. They shifted between cruelty and hesitation, as though their own psyches were fractured. One moment they mocked the victims, the next they seemed uncertain, as if wrestling with conscience. But conscience never prevailed. The final decisions were ruthless, irreversible, and devastating. The details of the crime remain haunting not because of gore, but because of silence. Once the violence subsided, the woods returned to quiet. The campfire still flickered, indifferent to what had happened. Nature does not mourn, it absorbs. For survivors and investigators, that indifference deepened the horror of the scene. After the killings, the perpetrators vanished into darkness, leaving behind shattered bodies and unanswered questions. Their departure was swift, as though they had rehearsed the retreat. Yet they carried with them no remorse, only the cold certainty that silence might protect them. In small towns, silence often becomes the greatest accomplice. The murder timeline does not end with the final breath of the victims. It extends into the hours afterward, when families waited unknowingly for children who would never return. Clocks ticked in bedrooms, meals cooled on tables, while in the woods the night guarded its secrets with ruthless loyalty. Investigators later pieced together the crime scene, but the timeline remains fractured. Trauma distorts recollection, and the killers left little evidence. What emerges instead are snapshots. The fire glowing against terrified faces, footsteps crushing leaves, the sound of desperate voices swallowed by wind. These fragments form the mosaic of tragedy. The girls' final moments illustrate the fragility of trust. They believed they were safe in a familiar place, yet danger came from within their own community. That betrayal magnified the horror. Safety is an illusion easily broken, and once broken it casts suspicion across every future moment of ordinary life. Even in terror, there were moments of humanity. One victim comforted another, whispering reassurance despite knowing survival was unlikely. Such gestures reveal the resilience of compassion, even in the face of cruelty. These details matter because they remind us that humanity endures, even when violence seeks to erase it. As dawn approached, the crime scene grew still. The fire died out, leaving behind embers like fading stars. The killers disappeared, the victims silenced, but the weight of what occurred lingered in the air. It was not just a murder, it was the violent erasure of innocence, leaving scars etched across generations. In the next part, we step into the uncertain world of investigation and public reaction. What unfolded was not a clear path to justice, but a tangled web of overlooked evidence, conflicting theories, and unanswered questions. The authorities tried to piece together fragments of truth, yet in doing so they often deepened the shadows surrounding the case. Meanwhile, the media turned private sorrow into a spectacle, amplifying fear and speculation until the tragedy belonged to everyone. The crime itself was horrifying, but the aftermath made sure its silence echoed far beyond that night, refusing to fade with time. The first officers to arrive at the Gitchie Manitou woods were unprepared for what they found. The silence of dawn contrasted sharply with the brutality revealed by the scene. The campfire, still smoldering, illuminated fragments of lives interrupted. For investigators, the task ahead seemed insurmountable, not only in evidence but in comprehension. Early reports show how investigators quickly struggled with the sheer disarray. Bodies were scattered, personal belongings left behind, and survivors traumatized beyond clear speech. Yet from the beginning, critical details were missed. Evidence ignored included footprints, shell casings, and potential signs of multiple perpetrators. Each oversight widened the gap between truth and speculation. The police theories initially revolved around chance encounters or random violence. Such explanations, however, underestimated the deliberate control exhibited during the crime. Some officers clung to these simplified narratives, perhaps out of denial or the psychological comfort of labeling chaos as accidental. Complexity often threatens authority, and institutions resist what they cannot easily explain. Witness statements proved both valuable and fragile. Trauma distorts memory, creating inconsistencies that investigators often misread as contradictions rather than symptoms of shock. Survivors described strange behavior, voices in the dark, and shifting dominance among attackers. Yet these testimonies were not fully integrated into police theories, leaving gaps where clarity should have been built. The community, meanwhile, recoiled in fear. A small-town murder shatters trust not only in safety, but in the fabric of belonging. Parents held children closer, schools tightened supervision, and rumors spread with viral intensity. The Campfire Massacre was no longer just a crime, it became a mirror reflecting collective vulnerability. Media frenzy followed swiftly. Reporters seized upon the tragedy, amplifying fear through headlines. Photographs of victims circulated alongside speculation, creating a narrative where certainty was absent. In such frenzy, compassion often gave way to consumption. Tragedy became content, and families endured the additional pain of their private grief, becoming public spectacle. Investigators fed into this frenzy, often releasing fragmented information to reassure the public. Instead, these updates deepened confusion. Contradictory statements circulated. Was it random? Was it targeted? Were drugs involved? Each theory spawned new rumors, while the core truth remained obscured. Silence once again became louder than any official explanation. Sociologists note that communities facing unsolved crimes often fracture along lines of suspicion. Neighbors glance differently, friends reconsider trust, and entire towns become prisons of paranoia. The Gitchie Manitou killings replicated this pattern. Innocence was not only stolen from victims, but also from a community that could no longer believe in itself. Police theories drifted between pragmatism and speculation. Some suspected local men with histories of violence. Others considered outsiders, drifters who exploited opportunity. Yet the evidence ignored at the scene, imprints in the soil, cigarette butts, inconsistent accounts, meant each theory lacked grounding. What emerged was less an investigation than a theater of uncertainty. For families, the investigation was agony. They demanded accountability, but institutions faltered. Some officers dismissed survivor accounts as unreliable. Others pursued dead-end leads, chasing rumors rather than patterns. The sense of being unheard deepened the trauma of loss. Grief is heavy enough. Combined with neglect, it becomes unbearable. Public reaction oscillated between empathy and voyeurism. Vigils were held, prayers spoken, yet alongside these gestures were whispered judgments. Why were the girls in the woods? Why so late? Communities often blame victims as a defense mechanism, a way to distance themselves from the terrifying truth that violence can strike anywhere. Psychologically, the investigation revealed institutional fragility. Law enforcement's need for certainty clashed with the complexity of the crime. Instead of embracing ambiguity, they resisted it. This resistance delayed justice and eroded public trust. Trust, once broken, is difficult to restore. Each ignored piece of evidence became another crack in the fragile foundation of faith. As days turned to weeks, the media frenzy reached fever pitch. The case was no longer about individuals but symbols. Innocence lost, community threatened, safety shattered. Each article fed collective anxiety, and soon myths overshadowed facts. In true crime, myths are seductive because they provide closure that reality often withholds. Yet reality lingered in unsolved details. Survivors remembered strange behavior from the attackers, gestures suggesting familiarity with the victims or the area. These details suggested planning, not randomness. Still, police theories clung to narratives of chance, perhaps unwilling to confront the horror that predators may have walked among them unnoticed. In time, investigative missteps became as much a story as the crime itself. Evidence mishandled, interviews misrecorded, timelines blurred. The tragedy of the Campfire Massacre extended beyond the night of violence into the days of bureaucratic failure. Institutions meant to bring order instead deepened chaos, leaving survivors isolated in their truth. The public response hardened, distrust in authorities grew, and conspiracy theories flourished. Some believed powerful individuals shielded suspects, others whispered of cults or secret societies. In the absence of clarity, imagination filled the void. Silence does not remain empty. It attracts invention, and invention often becomes more compelling than fact. Philosophically, the investigation revealed how societies confront horror. Stoicism teaches that control is limited, yet institutions strive for mastery, even where it is impossible. Christianity frames suffering as redemptive, yet here no redemption was visible. Buddhism reminds us that attachment causes pain, but communities could not detach from their shattered sense of safety. What endures from this stage of the story is not resolution but rupture. The crime fractured individuals, families, and institutions. The investigation, flawed and fragmented, widened those fractures. Public reaction, inflamed by media, ensured the wound could not close. It became a cold case not merely because it was unsolved, but because trust itself had frozen. As we enter the next part, the focus turns from the events themselves to the abyss that created them. We look beyond the killer's actions into the fractured psyche that shaped them, tracing the trauma, distortions, and deep shadows that transformed people into predators. Here the story shifts, no longer about what happened, but about why it happened, and what darkness truly means in the human mind. To understand the Campfire Massacre, we must step beyond the visible crime scene and into the invisible corridors of the human mind. Violence is not born in a vacuum. It is seeded in trauma, cultivated in secrecy, and unleashed when impulse finds opportunity. The killer's mindset did not emerge overnight. Psychological profiles constructed after the crime suggested deep instability. Traits of antisocial personality disorder appeared: lack of empathy, disregard for consequences, and thrill-seeking behavior. Combined with substance abuse or unresolved trauma, these traits become accelerants. Just as fire consumes wood, distorted identities consume morality until only predation remains. The killer's strange behavior, mocking victims then hesitating, speaks to fractured psyches. On one hand, they sought dominance and power, inflicting fear for gratification. On the other, their moments of uncertainty reveal conflict within. Such vacillation reflects cognitive dissonance, where a person simultaneously desires control, yet confronts faint echoes of conscience. Family secrets likely shaped this psychological foundation. Childhood neglect, abuse, or exposure to violence often leave hidden fractures. Developmental psychology shows that early trauma reshapes neural pathways, blunting empathy while heightening aggression. If cruelty becomes normal in a household, cruelty later emerges not as anomaly, but as continuation. Sociological perspectives add another layer. Small communities conceal shame behind silence. When violence brews in private, neighbors may suspect yet rarely intervene. This dynamic preserves appearances, but sacrifices truth. The killers may have carried reputations already tarnished, yet communal reluctance to confront darkness allowed predation to fester unchecked. From a philosophical perspective, the massacre illustrates humanity's perennial struggle with power. The Stoics warned against passions that enslave the mind. Here, desire for dominance enslaved the perpetrators themselves. They mistook violence for agency, when in truth they became captives of their own disordered impulses. Power pursued became powerlessness revealed. Christian thought sees such acts as ruptures with divine order. The image of God in man, distorted by sin, becomes unrecognizable when cruelty reigns. In this view, the killers surrendered not merely to impulse, but to the spiritual void, where absence of love manifests as violence without redemption. Buddhism would frame the massacre through attachment and ignorance, desire for control, attachment to ego, ignorance of compassion. These seeds blossom into suffering. The killer's actions spread suffering not only to victims, but to themselves, for no act of cruelty leaves the perpetrator untouched. Violence corrodes the soul of both victimizer and victim. Confucian ethics emphasize harmony and filial responsibility. The massacre symbolizes the collapse of these principles. The killers disregarded communal duty, rejecting the web of obligations that bind society. Their violation was not only against individuals, but against the moral fabric of the community. Disharmony expanded outward, eroding trust across generations. The aftermath of the massacre is measured not only in lives lost, but in psychological scars. Survivors carried trauma in silence. Flashbacks, insomnia, hypervigilance. Communities absorbed collective trauma, manifesting in suspicion, anxiety, and fear. Trauma psychology reminds us that wounds of the psyche can be more enduring than wounds of the body. Investigators, too, bore psychological weight. To face such brutality without resolution corrodes morale. Cold cases remind law enforcement of limitations. Some officers turned defensive, denying errors to protect fragile identities. Others internalized guilt. Institutions, like individuals, respond to trauma by either confronting it or burying it deeper. Here, burial prevailed. For families, grief became cyclical. Birthdays passed, anniversaries lingered, and empty chairs at dinner tables spoke louder than words. The lack of justice froze mourning, turning it into chronic pain. In psychology, unresolved grief manifests as depression, anger, or withdrawal. In philosophy, it becomes existential questioning. Why them? Why us? Why now? The killer's mindset reveals the darker side of human psychology. Control and dominance replaced empathy. Yet even monsters are not born fully formed. They are shaped by environments that fail to heal wounds, by communities that ignore warning signs, and by choices that accumulate into irreversible outcomes. Responsibility is never simple. Unsolved mysteries intensify aftermath. When answers remain elusive, imagination fills the void with speculation. Families imagine alternate scenarios, communities imagine conspiracies, and survivors imagine different choices. Each imagination is a form of self-punishment, a desperate attempt to reorder chaos. Yet order rarely comes. Silence remains the only enduring certainty. Modern criminology suggests such crimes should be revisited with new tools. DNA analysis, geographic profiling, and psychological autopsies may reveal what earlier methods ignored. Cold cases deserve renewed scrutiny, for justice delayed need not be justice denied. Perhaps one day clarity might emerge from the silence of Gitchie Manitou. But beyond forensics, deeper questions linger. Why they did it remains the haunting refrain. Was it thrill-seeking? Was it the desire to annihilate innocence? Or was it something darker, an attempt to erase in others what they could not face within themselves? Violence often mirrors inner voids projected outward. From a societal lens, the aftermath illustrates how communities metabolize fear. Some strengthen bonds, others fracture. Some pursue prevention, others retreat into denial. The massacre stands as a reminder that ignoring fractured psyches in individuals invites fractured futures for communities. Silence protects the predator, while conversation offers possibility of healing. In the decades since, the Campfire Massacre has remained more than history. It lingers in collective consciousness as parable. Parents caution children about danger. Communities whisper about trust. The story retold becomes myth, and myth becomes warning. Yet warnings cannot erase the weight of what was endured, only echo it forward. As we close this part, let us remember that true crime is not merely about acts of cruelty. It is about the human mind's capacity to fracture, to rationalize, to harm. It is also about the human spirit's refusal to forget. The killers sought silence, but silence has transformed into enduring witness. Next, in our conclusion, we will reflect on what remains, the lessons, the lingering questions, and the silent truths. We will leave with no neat answers, but with the echoes of what cannot be erased, because some crimes outlive their perpetrators, resonating in the quiet of generations yet to come. In the end, the Campfire Massacre stands as more than a crime preserved in memory. It is a mirror reflecting the fragility of human safety, reminding us that violence does not always arrive as an intruder from the outside, but often waits quietly within the folds of ordinary life. The darkness of that night continues to echo, leaving behind grief, fractured trust, and questions that no investigation has fully silenced. Every unsolved mystery is not only about the victims lost, but about the haunting reminder of how thin the line is between normalcy and terror. If fear itself is a mirror, then this story compels us to confront the reflection staring back, an image of humanity's most fragile edges. If this story resonated with you, please like, share the video, and subscribe for more journeys into silence and shadows. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.
References 1. Newton, M. 2006. The Encyclopedia of Unsolved Crimes. Infobase. 2. Schechter, H. 2003. True Crime, An American Anthology. Library of America. 3. Jenkins, P. 1994. Using Murder, The Social Construction of Serial Homicide. Routledge.